Good. I propose that we start now. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Benoît Pylyser. I'm a strategic advisor at the Challenges Forum International Secretariat, which is hosted by the Folke Bernadotte Academy in Stockholm. On behalf of our co-hosts, the Challenges Forum partner, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, we welcome you to this open webinar on the changing global order and the future of peace operations. We have participants from all over the globe, really, and we hope that all of you remain in good health and spirit, and that you will enjoy this next 1.5 hours in these times of global confinement. I'm very pleased to present our eminent panelists. We have Jean-Marie Guéhenno. He's currently a member of the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation. He also advises a number of think tanks and is the patron of our Challenges Forum. He was formerly a USG for Peacekeeping and president of the International Crisis Group, amongst many other national and international functions, which are too many to name here. It would take me too long, so you'll apologize me, Jean-Marie. Next, we have Cedric de Koning. He's a senior research fellow with NUPI and is also a senior advisor for the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD. Next, we have Michelle Ndiaye. She is currently the director of the Africa Peace and Security Program at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies in Addis Ababa, where she also heads the Secretariat of the TANA Forum. Sorry. She is a doctoral candidate in African Studies from Leipzig University. Next, we have Victoria Holt. She's the vice president at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Previously, Tori served as a U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations during the Obama administration. And lastly, we have David Haire. He is the director of the Policy Evaluation and Training Division in the UN Department of Peace Operations. At UN headquarters, David also served in the Department for Political Affairs and the Office of the Secretary General. Let me briefly take you through today's program. So we will kick off with Cedric, a brief presentation of about 7 minutes, followed by 1 or 2 questions from the audience. For the audience, please refer to the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom page. Next, we will go into a number of guiding questions directed to our panelists. Before every guiding question, we will run a poll with you, the audience, and allow time afterwards for a Q&A. And before closing, we will ask all the panelists to very briefly, in 1 minute, summarize how they see the future of peace operations in 10 years' time. It is my pleasure now to give the floor to the director of the Challenges Forum International Secretariat, Dr. Björn Holmberg, who also will be chairing this webinar. Björn, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Benoît. Challenges Forum partners, friends of Challenges, and colleagues in the UN, AU, and EU participating, and from other multilateral institutions. It's an honor and a joy to welcome such an esteemed group of panelists and colleagues to today's conversation. We're also very pleased to have you here, Jean-Marie, our patron, and of course, our 2 co-hosts for the webinar, NUPI, Norway, and IPSS, Ethiopia. I also want to welcome all of you, wherever you are in the world, participating in this webinar, spanning in time from, I think, 8 a.m. in New York to 10 p.m. in Canberra. We are transmitting this webcast from Challenges Forum International Secretariat, hosted by the Folke Bernadotte Academy, the Swedish Agency for Peace, Security and Development. In difficult times, we at the Challenges Forum continue to strive at finding new ways of providing an open and an impartial platform for an inclusive dialogue on peace operations. Many of you may be new to the International Forum for the Challenges of Peace Operations, or the Challenges Forum in its short format. So let me give you a brief introduction before we dive into our conversation. We celebrate 25 years at a global network next year, and members come from major troop, police, and financial contributing countries to peace operations, and also include the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. All in all, we are 50 departments and organizations in 23 countries. Our vision states that sustainable peace strengthened through effective peace operations and multilateral peace operations partnership. So for us, the partnership issue is central. Our mission states that Challengers Forum is a global partnership that uses its convening power to generate innovative ideas and promote results for more effective peace operations, which is very much in line with the purpose of today's gathering. In the strategy for the 5-year period adopted by our 50 partners, we have agreed on 2 strategic objectives. The first one is supporting effective reforms of peace operations, for example, action for peacekeeping, but also initiatives by regional organizations. Second, to help strengthen mission leadership and management. And to explore more, please visit our webpage, social media platform, or our YouTube channel to gain more experience and knowledge. You, looking at this, are more than 300 participants from over 40 locations globally, which is quite impressive. You have signed up to be part of this conversation. And I am very happy to greet especially those of you being in an ongoing peace operations, where we know that you, aside from the normal challenges, also are fighting the COVID situation. The dialogue between the panelists, guided by your initial questions when registering as participants, will hopefully provide food for thought and inspiration to collectively tackle both challenges and explore opportunities. So what are the issues of interest that you have indicated when registering? You see this word cloud, which provides an indication. And as you can see, and not very surprisingly, COVID-19 is of great interest, but also the main focus on changing global order and its effect on the future of peace operations. Furthermore, you want to get insights, you want to listen to experts and enjoy diverse perspective, which I believe we can provide through the Challengers Forum multicolored approach. We have framed the questions for the panelists in such a way as to touch upon many of those topics you see in front of you. And thanks to all for taking time to guide us and guide our conversation. We will let the participants in to ask questions on various occasions. On the screen in front of you, you can see a Q&A button. So if you look at the bottom, you should see that. Our moderator, Benoît, will invite you to pose questions. And given the large number of participants, more than 300, we will only be able to bring some of these questions into the conversation, but we will definitely keep them and bring them into future webinars. We also ask you to respond to 2 or 3 polls, as mentioned by Benoît, during the webinar to help us give ideas of your thoughts. After this session, we will publish this webinar on the Challengers Forum YouTube channel. And we also will provide you all participating with a 2-pager summarizing this conversation. We also hope that you can take a minute or 2 to respond to the survey coming to you at the end of the session. And more of this, I think we're all quite eager to take the next step. So what is the future of peace operations with a changing world order? I'm delighted to invite Cedric to, during 7 minutes, provide us with some nourishing reflections for the discussion to follow. Also, I invite the audience to pose a question or 2 on Cedric's presentation in the QA function. Cedric, the web is yours.
Thank you very much, Björn, and colleagues. What a wonderful opportunity to be speaking to all of you today. I'll take a few minutes to set the scene and introduce our discussion today. So Fanny, if you can go to the first slide. I will say a few words about how I understand peacekeeping in our conversation today. And then I will focus on longer term, medium term, and shorter term implications for the future of peace operations. So if we go to the next slide, on peacekeeping, what I wanted to say is that in the research on peacekeeping, as we've seen from a number of researchers over the last couple of years, perhaps most recently Lise Howard in her book on power and peacekeeping, that the findings are very clear that peacekeeping has a positive and statistically significant effect on containing the spread of civil war, increasing the success of negotiated settlements to civil wars, and increasing the duration of peace operations once a civil war has ended. And since the end of the Cold War, we see approximately 11 out of 16 UN peacekeeping operations that have ended successfully. You'll see them listed there, as well as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which are listed there as unsuccessful. And of course, then we have a number ongoing at the moment. The main point I wanted to make here, if we go to the next slide, is that I think the number of operations that we currently have in the Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mali, which is referred to as stabilization operations, are significantly different from the peacekeeping operations that have had such a good record. With peacekeeping, we essentially understand that United Nations peacekeepers deploy as an external third party that help the parties to the conflict to implement a ceasefire or a peace agreement on their request, in other words, with consent. And this is where the core principles of peacekeeping come in. Whereas with stabilization operations, the situation is more a case of a United Nations peacekeeping operation supporting a state against an aggressor that have been typically identified by the Security Council. So protecting a state and its people against specific aggressors. So in reality, it means there's no political consent from the parties to the conflict, only legal consent from the host state, no impartiality towards at least those aggressors that have been identified by the Security Council, and use of force is very much implied in the sense that these are all Chapter 7 operations. So I think these kind of stabilization operations are significantly different from the peacekeeping doctrine that we have, and that this is partly, I think, what describes, what it helps us to explain the kind of dilemma that we find with these operations. Stabilization theory presupposed that we have a legitimate state faced with an illegitimate insurgency. But the reality is never quite that simple. What if a state is captured by one set of elites linked to one identity group, and those who are excluded have genuine grievances related to marginalization and exclusion from political processes and economic participation? In that kind of scenario, the United Nations can easily be seen by some as a partial actor defending one part of society against another, and can even be perceived as a party to the conflict. And this leaves us then with a very delicate dilemma where the more the UN peace operation stabilizes the situation, the less incentive there are for the ruling elites to seek a political settlement. And the result is the kind of no peace, no war, frozen conflicts, which leaves the UN trapped with no exit path. And with the elites enjoying both the political cover that these missions provide, as well as the economic profits that the UN generates, in the sense that most of these elites are the ones who own the properties and hotels and the security companies and so forth that the UN have to employ in order for its operations to proceed. So if we go to the next slide, I think when we say peacekeeping works, we are very much referring to principled peacekeeping, and that I believe these principles of peacekeeping is precisely designed to help to prevent us from falling into the kind of trap where we have fallen to a large degree, I believe, with these stabilization type of operations. And I believe the further the UN peacekeeping moves away from these principles, the more ineffective and unsuccessful it is likely to be. So in this introduction, when I talk about peace operations and the future of peace operations, I'm mostly thinking in the context of principled peacekeeping operations. So if we go to the next slide, I focus on the longer term trajectory. I'm basing my thoughts here on an edited volume that Matea, Peter, and I had the opportunity to to publish about a year ago. And essentially what we found when we undertook this study is that in the context of a changing global order and the turbulence and uncertainty that accompanies such a major shift in power relations, what we will find on the peacekeeping side or peace operations side is a need to negotiate, to arrive at a new shared understanding of what the role of an international organization is when it comes to intervening in conflicts on behalf of the international community. And I think this will mean most probably that interventions will be more political, more focused on political solutions, more consent-based. There would be a tendency to avoid use of force or more controversial types of context where use of force may be at issue. I think the missions will be less intrusive or ambitious when it comes to democracy, promotion, security sector reform, transitional justice, in the sense that the new liberal values, which the UN to a large degree helped to promote in the last decade and a half under a unipolar international system, that these values will be much more open for negotiation, and there have to be a new set of values that everybody can agree upon will need to be arrived at in the next phase. I think there will be a strong focus on partnerships, especially with the African Union and the European Union. And then I think overall what we found in this study is that although UN peace operations have gone through various changes, various phases since its inception, the idea has been very resilient around this core principles of peacekeeping. And very many member states that are troop contributing countries or financial contributors who are politically committed to peace operations are committed to the idea and unlikely to move away from peacekeeping in the longer term. Peacekeeping remains the flagship identity of multilateral governance. So in that sense, the long-term trajectory, I think, is positive and in support of peace operations, and the resilience of peace operations, I think, will endure. If we go to the next slide and look more at the medium-term reality, then I do think that in the medium term, we see a very turbulent, uncertain period of contested multilateralism, increased major power rivalry, as we've already seen in Syria and Yemen. And I think this means that peacekeeping operations during this time are likely to be more limited, more conservative, maybe fewer in number, certainly not active in areas where there's major power contestation. And so one trend that we've already seen emerging is that there's a preference in the Security Council for special political missions versus peacekeeping operations during this period, and this is likely to continue perhaps. And this is perhaps partly because these special political missions are seen as having a lighter footprint, less controversial when it comes to perhaps perceptions of sovereignty and imposition of international operations. Also, they have less impact on the reputation of the UN. So where these operations in the Congo, Mali and Central African Republic has created various controversies, the political missions are less on the radar screen and there's less likely to cause that kind of negative reputations. And of course, they are financially quite cheaper in a context where we are under financial pressure. So we've seen no new peacekeeping operations since 2014. We've seen some operations recently like Colombia and Yemen, which are essentially ceasefire type operations deployed as special political missions rather than peacekeeping operations. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the transition in Darfur and what the new mission in Sudan is like, whether it will be a special political mission or a peacekeeping operation or some kind of a hybrid of the two. Then if we go to the shorter term reality, if we go to the next slide, I think here the focus is very much in the next 12, 18 to 24 months on the COVID-19 crisis. I think the operations, our peace operations have adapted in a very impressive way in a very short period of time to a significantly new reality that we are facing. But of course, it's impossible for these operations not to be affected in some ways in order to achieve their mandates and to continue even the essential operations. We know in some cases there are troop contributing, or rather there are units that are confined to base because of suspected infections. In South Sudan, for instance, the government has restricted the movement of the United Nations outside of bases because of a fear of infection and the perception of the virus being associated with foreigners. And then there's the freeze on rotations. We know that when that freeze is lifted, at the moment it's scheduled for 30th of June. It may change, of course, but we will see a major logistical challenge when, for the first time, all over the world, all the missions would want to rotate a percentage of their troops. There's limited logistical and aviation capacity to do that. So that will be a major crunch time and a major challenge for the missions. And then lastly, on the financial side, I think seeing that we're going into a global recession as a result of COVID-19, we can expect significant financial pressure on the United Nations, including peacekeeping operations. And I would not be surprised if we see a 30 to even 50% reduction in troops in peacekeeping operations over the next 24 months as a result of mainly financial, but also political and other disruptions in the global economy. So if we go to the last slide, conclusion, concluding thoughts. As I said, I think our longer term perspective, trajectory, if you like, I think is positive. Peacekeeping has shown that it's resilient. I think it will remain resilient. It will stay with us in the long term, and it will still have the identity more or less that it has now. I think in the medium term, the trajectory is going to be more conservative, a limited growth or a reduction in growth over the medium term. No major innovation, no major new types of, I think, peace operations, a conservative approach. And then in the short term, I think we see a contraction during the COVID-19 period, which perhaps if there are certain crises which demand those operations to be increased again. But if not, I think it will be very difficult in the financial and political environment to see these operations bounce back to their regional strength, short of a crisis-driven growth. So that's my short introduction for our discussion today, how I see the medium, long, and short-term trajectory of peace operations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for a very clear presentation and a stark reminder that principled peacekeeping does work. I also take note of the various challenges peace operations will be facing in the short and medium term, but that there is light at the end of the tunnel in the long term. So thank you for that presentation. Björn, I wanted to check with you at this point whether we have any questions from our audience.
Thank you, Benoît. Yes, we do have a lot of questions, but as you know, we are limited in time. So I'll read loud one of the questions that have come in, and that is, what role do you see for smaller, tailor-made operations such as the SPM in Colombia? Is that a model that can be reproduced in other more classical PKO settings?
And I propose that we ask Cedric to come in on that question.
Yes, I think we'll see a lot of innovation under financial pressure, under political pressure, for smaller type of operations, like the ones we have seen. So I do think that this will be one of the trends, but from time to time we will be faced with a situation where an operation needs a security guarantee. And I think that's where peacekeeping operations with military and police elements will still remain a factor.
Maybe you have time for one other question, Benoît, and it reads like this. Given the decline of international values and the future projections which focus on AU-UN relations, what will be the impact of peacekeeping operations in a time when international actors appear more focused on ceasefires which produce ecosystems based on negative peace and do not deal with the root causes of conflict? In essence, give the new changing world order, where there is a preference for SPMs and ceasefire, etc., what impact will this have on future peacekeeping and the re-emergence of old and new conflicts?
Thank you, Björn. That's a long question, so I would like to ask our audience to keep their questions as concise as possible. Cedric, did you want to take that question as well?
Well, I think my other panelists were much better suited to answer that question. I would just say that, of course, we don't expect peacekeeping operations to produce positive peace on their own. Peacekeeping is one step as part of a larger process, and there are many other actors involved that contribute and create positive peace, of which most importantly, of course, is the different national actors in that particular setting. So I think it's quite, it's not abnormal that a peacekeeping operations makes a contribution to negative peace and positive peace, but that many other actors would also contribute and step up in the larger positive peace context.
Thank you, Cedric. I propose that we now go into the guiding questions. The first guiding question will be addressed to Jean-Marie, followed by Tori. So the question goes as follows: how to sustain effective peace operations in a changing global order, and can the UN Secretary General's Action for Peacekeeping initiative create more consensus on the future of peacekeeping among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and troop and police contributing countries? As I briefly mentioned, we will first hold a poll with the audience, which should take about 10 to 15 seconds. It should appear on our screen now. So please submit your answers. The answers are anonymous, by the way, so no need to fear. Good. Can we have a look at the results? So we see that 63% of the respondents have indicated yes and 37% no. And with that, I would like to ask Jean-Marie to reply to the first guiding question. And Jean-Marie, please try to keep your answer as concise as possible, maximum 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I see that 63% or something like that believe that the Secretariat will change the support to peacekeeping, and then there is a strong minority which doesn't. I think I understand that divided poll because peacekeeping has always been a reflection of the international system. During the Cold War, it was a way to prevent, as Brian Urquhart has explained, it was a way for second-order conflicts not to escalate to the central East-West conflict. In the period of the early 2000s, in the first decade, I would say, of this century, more or less, there was a unipolar world and great ambitions that peacekeeping could almost re-engineer societies and build the kind of positive peace that we were discussing a moment ago. I think what we see coming now is different, and I would like to completely agree with Cedric de Koning. I would like to see the core principles of peacekeeping to remain the bedrock of peacekeeping. But I think that the useful distinction that he made between stabilization operations and peacekeeping operations has been steadily eroded, and it will continue to be so. Why? Because of the retrenchment that he described, but also more fundamentally because one of the few concerns were the major powers around the table of the Security Council can have some kind of agreement is the fight against terrorism. And we see how this terrorism agenda is polluting peacekeeping. We certainly see it very clearly in Mali, where the peacekeeping operation is in the midst of a war against terrorist groups. And my point is that it's going to be very hard for peacekeeping to establish that clear distinction between stabilization and peace operations. It's going to be difficult also because what Cedric says on legitimacy, legitimate government, the members around the Security Council table don't have the same definition of legitimacy. And for them, a government that keeps a country more or less stable is legitimate enough. And so how do we define legitimacy is an open question today, where there is no fundamental agreement in the Security Council. So how to go about it? The strength of peacekeeping has been to be, while sticking to a few core principles, to be pretty resilient and adaptive. Indeed, a number of peacekeeping operations, it has been in the gray area where it tried to build the legitimacy of a government, at the same time stabilizing that government. I think we're going to see more of that, but there are traps, and I would make a few points there. First, we see that one of the traps is when you try to stabilize, when you turn peacekeeping into stabilization, the risk is that the government just thinks that he doesn't have to build its own legitimacy and relies on the peacekeepers. And that's what we have seen in situations like, for a long time, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in some ways what we see sometimes in Mali. And so it's clearly very important to press a government to be center stage in the stabilization and to be center stage in building its own legitimacy. That's why I believe that peace operations more and more will have a focus on security sector reform and supporting government action rather than substituting it. But it will need to be a holistic view of security sector reform, not just a technical view, but a view that builds the legitimacy of the security forces, which is often very low. Second point, I think in this foggy environment, so to speak, you're going to see more and more multiple actors working side by side. Will they work at cross purpose, or will they work in a coordinated manner? I think that is going to be a second major challenge of peace operations in the future. Third, in that search for legitimacy, for a new consensus on legitimacy between countries that have very different views, I think the Europeans and the Africans have a critical role to play. As we know, most peacekeeping operations are in Africa, and Africa is a major key interest for the Europeans because of the geographic proximity of the two continents. I think it's important that the Europeans and the Africans work together to help push through the UN a concept of legitimacy that can have broad support, that will be probably less ambitious than what we have seen in the heydays of the 2000s, but that would nevertheless not be reduced to just stabilizing a government, whatever that government may be. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. That was very well respected in terms of timing. You just went over a little bit. So thank you very much on I think very, very enlightening on the various traps of peacekeeping. At this point, I would like to ask Tori to answer the question. Tori, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on being able to put something together that spans, I think, continents on this topic. Obviously, there's a change in global order, And I think the one that's most acute for us right now is watching the challenges in the Security Council. But I'm also going to point out what is obvious to everybody, which is this has been going on for quite a while, whether it's the rise in extremism and proxy conflicts, the expansion and availability of small arms and abuse of humanitarian human rights law during conflict, the migration crisis that's faced much of the world, and then also the shocks of climate change, adding to that disinformation campaign. So in some ways, peacekeeping has always walked alongside or deployed alongside global shifts. I don't think we can find a really genuinely static moment, but this feels accelerated. And it certainly feels accelerated in the context of the pandemic that we're discussing today. So I won't get into that particular mix. I think the next section is on it, but I will congratulate DPO and the UN and DOS and everyone for moving quickly to try and reshape the missions to try and address the pandemic in the moment, and look forward to that conversation. I will also say that peace operations is both deeply resilient, but not completely flexible. And also it's part of its strength. And it's worth, I think, stating up front again, how much peacekeeping is actually an example of multilateralism in a practical effect. And if you look at the council, I think either Cedric or Jean-Marie said, counterterrorism is a place they come together. But they come together enough that we have these peace operations today. We tend to think of the big five, but we have other ones. And they're a version of peacekeeping and peace operations we shouldn't forget. So that does not give me a crystal ball, but find me something else in the world with over 100 countries that deploy into difficult places without a guaranteed outcome of success, and to do that constantly in difficult environments. So I don't say that to be overly rosy, but I do want to remind us that this is already something that has survived many ups and downs. So if I take that combination of global challenges and I look at the A4P frame, what I'd like to do is highlight 4 or 5 things where I think things are moving forward and A4P rightly brings attention to it. And that is an expression, I think, of over 150 countries' commitment, which is extraordinary, but also to flag them in the context of the global challenge and maybe push forward where some of those issues could be further accelerated. First is the politics. People say that's primary. That is true. But we need more than a good agreement in the beginning. If you're going to have a smart peacekeeping mission that's going to be able to continue to have consent and the support of the parties, we need a better way to monitor and understand when that is fraying. I saw in the Security Council Safety and Security Resolution, they now formally require when freedom of movement is restricted in the field, that it be reported to the Council. That's just one of many things that I think should be addressed. So we need a better operationalization of understanding what the political agreements and consensus could be if parties are not showing up to talks, if there's constraints on the mission. And that's also for the Council. The bilateral and multilateral is always something that needs to go together. It's not just the ambassadors in New York and the team that back them up. Capitals need to pick up the phone. We've known this forever, but that gets to the politics and also to the partnership. A second issue that is clear is the funding crisis. And while missions have really taken on responsibility in the field, so it's hard to find stories of how the $1 billion plus assessment gap between many of the governments, including the United States, affects the deployment of peacekeeping. My understanding is it is both a debt that is then borne by the troop and police contributing countries, and also creates inflexibility in the field. So if you have a mission, you can't assume any new resources. So I think that that's got to be addressed, and I think that's something I would put on the list. Third, on political partnerships, and Cedric, you touched on this, we are not there yet on figuring out how to deal with the partnerships, particularly in Africa, dealing with extremist environments and the role of the UN. This is not just a funding issue. I certainly understand the argument that the UN should fund logistics, but I think the conceptual problems are very deep, and co-locating foreign forces, AU, UN, all together in an environment where the rest of the world just sees it as one group, puts everything in harm's way. It's a soft target, we know this. And sometimes I think it papers over the lack of a political understanding of how to move forward and harms the UN's limited use of force for protection of civilians and its protections of itself, which is something we've all come to agree on. All right, quickly, fourth and fifth. Particularly after COVID, I think there's parts of the world where the UN's doing well and could go further and deeper. Believe it or not, one is the environmental strategy, the Department of Support and DPO and others have believed it. It's talked for a long time about thinking about modernizing missions, making it more efficient. to what extent could the aspirations, including the Secretary General's aspirations, to have the UN be 80% renewable energy by 2030 for all its emissions, which includes the field operations, actually open up the door to talk to local communities, align with the SDGs, and support host nation commitments. In other words, could there be a better work with the country team, not just in the moments of transition, but at the entry point? Not that it challenges peacekeeping, which is first goals are peace and security, but in its operations, are there ways to basically align those things, such as the use of energy and other ways that the missions operate in the field? So I would flag that as something that the COVID crisis, which has pushed healthcare into the front, there may be a better conversation about positive peace for the communities. And then finally, I think that the partnership in the Security Council does need a reset. And I would just say, at least on behalf of the United States, it's not like the United States had a huge debate about the role of the UN in peacekeeping, and that the current administration, therefore, is taking that forward. I think this is a work in progress. And I think it's a debate the United States needs to have. And I think other countries are in the same place. And usually peacekeeping is re-embraced when it's at most risk. So I don't have a crystal ball between Cedric and Jean-Marie's imagining of the medium, long-term, and immediate long-term future. But I do believe that for those of us who value this, it's time to roll up our sleeves, engage in the conversation in a way that perhaps we haven't had to in at least a decade or more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tori, for that. I propose at this point that we go straight into guiding question 2, which is on the topic of COVID-19. And let me just say that when registering, and Björn has said that we have over 300 people that registered, a great deal of people indicated the topic of COVID-19 as of high interest. So the second guiding question will be directed to Michel and to David. So it reads as follows: how is COVID-19 impacting international relations and peace operations in particular? And what other factors you believe will impact the future of peace operations? Again, we will first take the poll, which should appear on the screen now. Please submit your answers. Thank you. And we see that 69% believe that COVID-19 can positively impact multilateralism in the long run. 31% does not believe it can positively impact multilateralism. So with that, I would like to ask Michel to take the floor. Michel?
Thank you, Benoît, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm pleased with the result of the poll, but I think I will have a slightly different view when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on international relations today. I think the pandemic has found already a very shifting geopolitical landscape that is currently threatening the international rule-based system, and that is very clear. We've been talking about multilateralism being under threat for the past 1 or 2 years, and I think it's really showing. In fact, I think the pandemic has a little bit amplified existing division among global actors. We have seen increased fragmentation of international cooperation, less sense of leadership, but also the failure of global cooperation in a sense. And there is no doubt that that political health and security paradigm shift will not affect the future of peace operation, particularly in Africa. So I believe that the first issue perhaps that we need to bear in mind would be financing. I believe Cedric mentioned it earlier in his presentation. But I recall since 2018, the number of discussion that was held by the UN Security Council around funding, and particularly when it comes to peace support, peace operation on the continent. And I think Jean-Marie also mentioned it earlier. For me, that's perhaps one major impact of the pandemic. The second one, and this is happening also while existing security threats are still very important and very deep on the continent. And what I'm seeing currently is perhaps with these pandemics, a confluence of existing security threats that will be moving in waves to countries that have not been affected for the moment. When I say confluence of security threats, I mean violent extremism, terrorism, climate-induced conflict together, moving in wave to other territories that are not affected. And I say that because obviously, Cedric, you mentioned adaptation of peacekeeping, peace operation forces today, but I do also think that current national armies are all mobilized to fight the pandemics. And that's, for me, is a risk of spreading having these armed groups to gain more territories during the pandemics. The third aspect that I would like to mention is issues of access to population, particularly in conflict areas. When I say population, I particularly mean displaced population and refugees. And I think this is a time where it's going to be very difficult to have access to that, to those population. And this is also a risk of having the pandemic spreading in refugees camp, for instance. So this is a particular issue we need to take into account. I also think that after the pandemics, the real future of peace operation will be as important as the investment in health system, as we have been discussing it since the beginning of the pandemics. And this is, for me, an opportunity that armed groups will use to consolidate their position. And despite the adaptation of peace operation forces on the ground, I do believe that it's going to allow armed group to consolidate their position on the ground. And finally, I think we need to come back to what you said earlier, Cedric. I think it's about looking at peace support operation and international cooperation from a more holistic approach, because I do believe that you mentioned very clearly that the doctrine currently when it comes to stabilization is that what is in question. And I do believe, particularly in Africa, we need to come back to cooperation and look at the doctrine on short-term stabilization and long-term stabilization. And that distinction for me is quite important. And it's going to be the future of the security policy and the future of peace operation will lie on those responses we're going to bring to how we look at the doctrine moving forward and analyzing very clearly the impact of the pandemics on, particularly on African, on the continent and on affected countries today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I particularly like your point on the need for a holistic approach. We can't only solve problems through peace and security, but that in particular now we need to look at strengthening health systems, wider governance systems, and that for that we need a multilateral approach as well. So thank you for that. At this point, I would like to ask David to come in. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Benoît and Björn, for this opportunity. Coming at the end, I would say I very much agree, and particularly with what Michelle just said. So maybe I'll say a quick word on how the missions are currently responding and then try to look forward further. I mean, first of all, as has been mentioned, there's been an effort to try to have missions adjust rapidly to the pandemic. Rotations have been suspended, as Cedric mentioned, in order to ensure that the missions don't act as a vector for the disease. There have basically been four key priorities. One is the sort of missions need to take care of their own personnel, social distancing, trying to make sure we have the medical resources in place. Secondly, they need to avoid being a vector. Thirdly, begin to help governments, host governments address the pandemic. And we've seen missions providing equipment, mission radio stations working on social media and providing information, Radio Okapi even turning into an educational tool, providing education to the some 20 million children in the DRC who are out of school, and so on. And then lastly, of course, the missions need to carry on their mandates. The Secretary General's call for ceasefire has been successful in places, but certainly not in many areas. And so, as has been mentioned, armed groups, etc., are not taking necessarily this moment to pause, but actually are taking advantage. So the missions are trying to take those actions. At the same time, I think we are beginning to see political impacts of the pandemic in the immediate term. We see some host governments which have had a history of trying to restrict the movement of peacekeeping operations, such as we've seen in South Sudan in the past, continuing to place restrictions on the mission, but now with COVID-19 being an additional reason. We've seen other events on the political front, so for example, in Central African Republic, there have been efforts to suspend term limits, and that has created political opposition. So I think we're beginning to see how COVID-19 is impacting political processes, and missions will have to adjust to that. Over the longer term, I very much agree with those who said that COVID-19 is amplifying social inequalities, placing huge strains on national economies. And I think that will both have the potential of creating more cause for conflict while potentially fraying at the idea and the resources necessary for a multilateral and combined response. So it's a bit difficult at the moment to see what all the impacts will be, but I certainly agree that the financial impacts will be strong. And so there has been pressure already over the last years since the 2008-9 financial crisis on the budgets of peacekeeping. I think that will continue, but it's worth noting that peacekeeping didn't shrink as a result of that financial crisis. There was a lot of pressure on the budgets, but essentially peacekeeping adapted, as has been said, and it's now 15% or more cost effective as measured per peacekeeper. So peacekeeping is cheaper today to deploy 100,000 peacekeepers than it was before. So it's shown an ability to respond to that. And the global community found that the broad burden sharing shoulders that are represented by the UN in terms of financial burden sharing and political burden sharing are necessary to be maintained. And so even with the financial crisis, we saw a continuation of reliance on peacekeeping. The last thing I'll say is there's been some discussion about whether there's another model. And I just want to question this idea that there's one model, which is a large multidimensional peacekeeping operation with lots of troops, and that's peacekeeping. And there's another model, which is anything else, and that's an SPM. For many, many years, we've had a variety of different missions and operations. I think what we need to ask is what is needed to address the conflict? And generally, there are three things that are needed. You need a political process. If you need a security guarantee for that political process, and then you need efforts to address the peace building gaps, whether it's on state support, security sector reform, etc. And each conflict will have a different formulation. But it's not like one model or another is to be chosen. Even where you see SPMs, someone needs to provide a security guarantee. And if you don't have a security guarantee, then you have Libya, you have Yemen. In some cases, the security guarantee may not be possible because you don't have a political process. And there is where we've been talking about some of these challenges with stabilization operations. So I just want to see us talk about peace operations as a spectrum of needs, and that we would bring the UN's tools flexibly to be applied. In some cases, you might start without the need for a UN security guarantee because there might be another partner like the AU. And then because of the burden sharing tool that the UN represents, the UN might need to come in. So I want to be careful about that sense of duality. We've seen with the large operations, all of the challenges we've mentioned, but civilian casualties across Mali and CAR and South Sudan have been nothing compared to civilian casualties in Libya, Yemen, Syria, etc. So we also need to realize that containment can have a value, even as you're searching for political peace. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, David, for that inside view from DPO in the COVID-19 response, and also reminding us of the importance of having a tailor-made peace operations in line with the context on the ground. I think that's very welcome. At this point, I would like to ask Björn if we have some questions from the audience.
We have the nice dilemma of having too many questions, but we'll pick one here in the staff that we would like to raise. And it sounds like this. Nobody has mentioned EU crisis management mission so far. Do you see any future role of CSDP missions in the future? What could that be? Or should Europeans rather put their assets, resources, and commitment completely into UN peace operations?
Thank you for that. I propose that we ask Jean-Marie to answer that question. Are you fine with that? Please unmute.
That's it.
Thank you.
Yes, no, I'm fine. I think EU will continue to be a significant actor. Personally, I think one major flaw of EU operations is that distinction between EU operations and EU training missions. Because in my view, and I briefly alluded to that in my initial presentation, in my view, training has to be embedded in operations. And the notion that you can separate it from operations has shown time and again that it doesn't work. You train troops that then disappear or are never confronted with reality. I think the question for the EU is, if you combine training and operations, are you prepared to take the risks that go with the operations? I think there will be increasing pressure on the European Union countries to accept a measure of risk. And I think the future is probably of a combination, as was already said, of several actors working together on the ground: United Nations, African Union, European Union, and sometimes bilateral efforts for the sharp edge of counterterrorism operations. And the question is whether these various forces will work at cross purposes, or whether they will be able to work together in an intelligent and coordinated way. I think at the moment, the jury is out.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Björn, do we have another question from our audience?
We can add one more, and it goes like this. How do you see the core issue of protection of civilians being addressed by the proposed SPM or such hybrid structures?
Thank you for that. I propose we present that question to David. Are you fine with that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And indeed, as we're looking at the issue of the follow-on presence in Sudan, and particularly winding down the mission in Darfur, we're definitely looking at this question of what could be a protection of civilians effort under an SPM context. And certainly the sovereignty concerns which Cedric mentioned are at play here, and so there's not a desire to see large numbers of troops. But we are trying to see whether or not, for example, police tools could be used, other kinds of civilian protection, which we already have in our peace operations, using civil affairs officers, outreach to create community alert networks, closer work between security sector reform efforts and using government functions, but focusing them on protection using UN early warning and response. Those are some of the things that we are trying to look at. But again, I want to be clear, you know, it's not a question of can you fit POC into SPMs? It's a question of understanding what is the threat to civilians and what needs to be done to address that threat. Where is it coming from? If you have the need for an external security guarantee and you don't address that threat because there's ongoing conflict, then I think you should expect continuing civilian casualties, which is why I mentioned the point I did, that in a lot of places we have SPMs, but we don't have peace. We have ongoing conflict, and we have much, much higher civilian casualty rates. One of the challenges, though, is that those civilian casualties are seen to be a broadly diffused responsibility of the international community. Everyone and no one is responsible. When you deploy a peacekeeping operation, then sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, given the size, the scope, the scale of the country, the responsibility lies with the peacekeeping operation and the UN. And I think that is a difference that is important. So we certainly need to look at how we can carry out the protection of civilians function using civilian tools, using a work with government. But that presupposes a government that wants to protect its citizens, security services that are willing to try to work with it. And then I think there are lots of things which an SPM can do. But if direct physical protection is required and there are no actors ready to do that, then you will have civilian casualties. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Tori, I could see you were heavily nodding. So did you want to comment on this question, please?
Yeah, I just want to really highlight something that David noted, and it picks up on the SPM conversation. The trend in the world includes so much more violence against civilians, and some of it is the side effect of conflict, but a lot of it's purposeful. And the civilians are the target. And I think that's what differentiates in part the problem of a Syria, a Libya, even at times Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, where a peacekeeping mission cannot replace basically a security guarantee when the civilians are the target. But what David's point out is so key, which is we always need to ask, what are the threats to civilians? What is the cause of it? And what do we do about it? And sometimes that's partly the political agreement, but that is not something that an SPM necessarily solves as easily as a peace operation, which has a multiplicity of skills that can bring to it, including knowing the local community. And so what I mean by that is some of the strategies developed is to get out, go talk to people, find out what's going on locally, and distinguish between, you know, an attack on a group of women going to a market, some, you know, errant security forces, or a government-backed militia that's crossing a border. And so I think that peacekeeping also brings to it a tactical understanding that is so key to long-term success through public diplomacy, through the radio, through understanding the local dynamics. And so I just don't want to gloss over, because I think it links back to kind of the Cedric's point about SPMs. They're incredibly valuable, but they themselves may not come in with all the tools that are needed for sustaining peace and protection of civilians. Thank you.
Thank you, Tori. Björn, I propose we take one more question on this topic.
Yes. I should just note for everyone that due to bandwidth issues, Michelle cannot have her video on, if anyone wonders. And I have one question here, and that is, can you please reflect on the impact of COVID-19 on the women, peace and security agenda?
Thank you for that. Tori, would you like to take this question, or do we have any other panelists with their hands up? David, the floor is yours.
Well, I mean, others may want to join, but I do think it's a very important point. The Secretary General has obviously issued a sort of a paper on this. And at least in the context of the peace operations, I think there are a number of points. One is that obviously in countries, and we have yet to see the size of the wave of COVID-19 that will hit in some of the host countries where we have our peace operations, and this goes for SPMs as peacekeeping operations, so I'll say peace operations. I think that we have yet to see the size of the wave that will hit. But a lot of the social distancing, which we've seen in Western countries or more developed countries, including China, will not be options in countries where people need to go out to get what they can to survive the next day, where they don't have the resources in terms of savings, they don't have the space, because as has been mentioned by Michelle, they may be in IDP camps, etc. And I think in these contexts, a lot of the burden will fall on women. And so we need to continue to use the outreach networks, the local women's organizations which we engage with, to see how we can address and support those concerns using government, UN country team, etc. And those networks are there and are being pushed to the fore. So both in terms of providing support, I think we need to try to address women who are obviously very often the ones who are in the front lines of caring for families, as well as continuing to find resources. But then I think also in terms of building up afterwards, there will be opportunities as we look to bring in women into discussions around how to reconstitute protective structures in societies. I think there'll be opportunities for discussions with government, discussions on political processes that will address the impact of COVID-19 as recovery happens. And I think that will be a chance not to forget, again, the question of women's participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that. In view of our time, I propose we go to the third guiding question, which will be addressed to Michelle and to Cedric. So the question goes as follows. In an era of networked peace operations, in which the UN is one of many actors, how are UN peace operations adapting to support the strategic political coherence of larger national, regional, and international efforts? And should the UN focus more on conflict prevention and opt for peacekeeping only as a last resort, and only when regional capacities, such as, for example, EU, AU, are absent? We will first have our poll. So please submit your answers. Can we have the result, please? So we see that 63% answered yes and 37% answered no. So with that, I would like to ask Michelle to take the floor.
Thank you, Benoît. I think that we need to look at prevention as a continuum. I believe that when we do peacekeeping, we also do prevention. And I think we tend to actually cluster prevention, thinking that it's only when you have positive peace that society is smooth, it's where prevention happen. But I think during peace operation, we also do a lot of prevention and we avoid relapse into conflict. So let's look at it as again as a continuum. And I like what David said about the spectrum of needs that need to be used and tool applied to the needs that have been identified. So I believe that using the current setup we have, the networked peace operation that we have allows us actually to better prevent conflict if collaboration and adaptation are part of the strategy. I do believe that during peace operation, particularly, and I will take the example of the African Union peace support operation, for instance, whereby prevention is being now used more and more as the tool to prevent conflict, and less peace operation because of lack of funding. I do believe that we need to look at it again from a holistic approach and make sure that we select the need, identify the need, and apply the tools that are available. And that happens along the spectrum of conflict, particularly on the continent, when you see a mix of different conflict coming together in one particular area. And I think the COVID-19 crisis will allow one thing at the end of the day, is if there is less funding, particularly for regional peace operation, it's going to actually allow the African Union to build more capabilities at regional level. And I think that is an open question. We used to discuss about the African peace and security architecture, but this is time with COVID-19 and perhaps less funding coming to peace operation, that the continental body will finally put its act together and be able to find other funding, particularly from a regional base and from national mobilization of resources.
Thank you, Michelle, on that hopeful note in regards to AU funding. Cedric, did you want to comment on at this point?
Thank you very much. Yes, I tried to vote no several times, but unfortunately the panelists are prevented from voting on the poll. I think that it is not sensible to have a fixed division of work where, for instance, the African Union provides the boots and the UN provides the political brain. That's not the reality on the ground. The African Union and regional organizations and other actors are as active and should be as active as the United Nations on the prevention front, on the political front, on mediation, on peace building, on peace operations. And so I think we need a cooperation, a strategic partnership. I mean, a network, the strength of a network lies in its distributed ability. And that if in a particular circumstances, part of the actors or elements in a network do not have a comparative advantage, then other parts of the network can take over. That's precisely where the resilience of a network comes in. And I think we've seen this in the African Union, United Nations relationship over time. There's certain type of challenges where the United Nations has a comparative advantage. There are others where the African Union or a regional organization or an ad hoc coalition has the comparative advantage. So we need to remain flexible. What we do need to have more predictable, if you like, is the coordination mechanisms, the strategic partnerships that do enable us on a case-by-case basis to crystallize out, what constellation of actors is the best suited for this particular problem. So I don't think we should have a division of work which says, African Union does the more robust peace operations and United Nations does prevention and political. I do think we need a flexible and nimble approach, a very strong cooperative partnership between all these actors. We mentioned the EU earlier as well, including the European Union and other actors globally that have a role to play in this.
Thank you, Cedric. At this point, I would like to ask Björn if we have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we actually have a question from Ambassador Ashraf Swelan, the director of CCCPA, which I think aligns well with the main focus of today's webinar. and that is how will the evolving geostrategic trends impact the future of peacekeeping operations? Are there areas of agreement between the P5 members?
Thank you. Can I see a hand from one of the panelists? If not, I will. Jean-Marie, please go ahead.
Yes, I believe that at the moment, the main area of agreement is on counterterrorism. But it's a very dangerous area of agreement, in the sense that once you have said that you are against terrorists, there are many ways to address the issue. You can address it by trying to crush them. You can address it by trying to peel off those groups who have just a local agenda and who might be integrated into a political process. And there is no real consensus among the P5. And so I think this is going to be a very difficult situation to address. I am afraid that in the future we'll continue to see serious divisions among the P5 on that key issue. Nevertheless, they all fear the development of so-called ungoverned spaces. And an interesting case in point will be the future of Afghanistan when the US withdrawal is completed, because certainly the next door neighbors, including China, do not want Afghanistan to fall back into the kind of situation that happened after the withdrawal after the Soviet Union had collapsed. Nobody wants that. How will the international community deal with that situation? How will China get involved or not? Will there be use of some kind of United Nations framework? And I use the word framework on purpose because it can mean many different things. I think that's the kind of issue where we will see whether the P5 can come together or not.
Tori and David, you had your hands up. Did you want to come in at this point? And if so, can you do so very briefly, because I think we need to move on. Tori, did you? No, David, the floor is yours.
Well, just to say that I think that one interesting question that Jean-Marie's answer poses is, will we shift from the post 9/11 consensus around the counterterrorism as the mode, which pushed us towards stabilization operations, to something which is more characterized by great power competition? And I think that that's an interesting question for us to consider, and what the impact would be for UN peace operations. And do we, on our side, then need to be working more to outreach across a number of different poles, the P3, the P5, regional actors, and other rising powers even more actively than we have, to try to build a consensus around different types of UN intervention? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I propose we now go into the final questions. So as mentioned, I would like to ask all of the panelists to very briefly sketch how you see peace operations in 10 years' time. And I would like to start with Cedric.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll repeat the conclusion of my introduction to say that I think in the short term, we're going to see a contraction. I think in the medium term, we're going to see a very conservative environment for peace operations. We may see some, let's say, technical innovations where we try different things in that very conservative and limited space. But I don't think it's a time for major new innovations and themes and so on. But in the long term, I think peace operations have proven that it's a resilient part of the international response and crisis management and conflict management. UN peacekeeping in particular has a very solid identity. and I think will be part of multilateral governance going forward. What particular shape it will take will differ, as we've seen over the many years, but I think it will still be identifiable as UN peacekeeping, as it was 75, 80 years ago, and it will probably remain the same for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. Next, I would like to ask Michelle.
Thank you, Benoît. Let me be the most positive one here, to say that I do believe that there would be an increase capabilities at regional level in the next 10 years. And as Cedric mentioned earlier, there will be no distinction between the African Union, the regional organization, and the UN when it comes to peace operation and peacekeeping. I do believe that the shared understanding that we time to time see as a barrier to successful peace operation will be enhanced through cooperation and partnership, and particularly the UN AU partnership that we have currently. But I also think that if there is one wishful thinking that we should perhaps have, is shared responsibility. And for me, that's in the near future, but also in the long term, is an important ingredient that will actually assist in dealing with peace and conflict on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michelle. David, can I ask you to go next?
Thank you. I think, you know, we're very interested in the Department of Peace Operations in the question of what the future of peacekeeping and peace operations, and we will actually be launching a process, and this has been an extremely helpful input into that. But over the next months, we'll be engaged in an internal process, and then with partners more widely on this question, sort of what peace operations are likely to look like in the next 5+ years. I think we'll obviously need to look at many of the themes that have come up here. The question of the nature of the political commitment between member states at the council and internationally, how to deal with shaky political processes, the use of proxy warfare, and the difficulty in political intractability of a lot of conflicts on the ground, and what that means for peace operations. I think we'll obviously need to keep an eye on and prepare for the global economic downturn. And I think that will force more adaptation from us. And other trends which were already pre-existing, technology and conflict, the impact of social media and hate speech, and that on conflict narratives and driving conflict. Getting better engaged in the political economy of conflict, and realizing some of the benefits of a spectrum, a pillar approach, which the Secretary General actually had with regard to peace and security, to link it better to economic engagement. I think coming out of COVID-19, the linkage between economic crash and conflict may be much more stark, and we may need again to do what Jean-Marie used to say decades ago now, the need to bring us together closer with the Bretton Woods institutions in our interventions. Climate and conflict, I think, is another issue which we will need to try to understand better. It's always hard to make the causal link, but nevertheless, COVID is presenting us with one potential link between climate and social impact. So I think these are some of the areas which we'll be continuing to look at and try to prepare peace operations to adapt, because adapt they must and will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Next, I would like to ask Tori.
Thank you very much. I think in the short run, it'll be very interesting to see if the world can actually come together and figure out what the pandemic, what the scientists naturally do, which is work together to figure out tests and vaccines, and if that then creates an environment of cooperation or if it remains one of competition. I think that'll have a lasting effect a bit on kind of whether or not competition or cooperation is what we see for the future. We have recovered from this before. I could take Jean-Marie's point about counterterrorism and expand it. I would imagine in 10 years, we're a lot better at having countries and their own populations rise up and say, we would like your support to implement a peace agreement versus just a little bit more of a top-down. Say it's the Colombia model, where there's a willingness and a commitment to peace that is presented to the international community and support is asked for. I think a lot of times we talk about this as whether the P5 will agree on it, but I think it depends a lot on what organically comes up. And it's hard for me not to imagine there's going to be a renewed need for that. There's a number of countries that have really faced horrific war and violence. And there'll be a point when they're like, this will be naturally coming to a conclusion, and it will need the UN, and we'll need broad peace operations. Also, I guess to something David just said, we need a bigger and broader toolkit to deal with some of these problems. Disinformation campaigns are now rampant, and how the UN handles information, strategic communications is on that list. We've already talked about protection of civilians. It's not just a task for UN missions, it's an assessment in the beginning of why civilians are in harm's way, why they're being targeted, and that the tools need to acclimate to that, working with local communities so that they themselves have the voice in what's going on. I also think in the future, climate issues could be a uniting factor for the Council. We're not there right now, but I can definitely imagine it, not just as a risk factor, but for a way to rethink how operations are even designed. Why do we have old containers that need air conditioning and heat? I would take up the Secretary General's challenge, and that the UN becomes 80% based on renewable energy by 2030, which he called for last fall at his climate summit. So I think there's some positive areas as well where the UN can really lead, and I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tori. Some very good points there. And last but not least, Jean-Marie.
Thank you. Well, much will depend, as Tori just said, on the balance between competition and cooperation. Myself, I fear that medium term, you're going to see continued competition, not just between global powers, but more and more between regional powers. What does that mean? I think one has to expect less resources for peace operations. And so one will have to make the best of that. The issue of intelligence, of using the predictive value of data, I think we're going to make tremendous progress in that area. And so that's a domain in which peace operations can probably benefit from technology and make further saving and deploy in a very astute way, but they will have to be nimble for that. They already have made great improvement in that respect, but they have to make more. So first point, less resources. Second point, the question of trust. The Colombia example is a good one of trust being built from the bottom up. And so meaning that there is less demand on the international community to be the third party that brings trust. I think there are many other situations where we'll continue to see an erosion of trust. And that will make the point for the need for third parties. That's why I think the notion of SPM as the be-all and end-all is naive. There are situations where you do want the reassurance of a third party, and that third party has to have guns. But at the same time, precisely because there is no trust, you may not want that third party to be too strong, because you'll be afraid that it's going to be hijacked by one of the big powers. And so this balance between having a third party strong enough to provide reassurance, but not so strong that it can dominate the agenda for the benefit of a power, that's something that the UN will have to work with. Third point, which is a reflection of, I hope, the development of the African Union. I think we're going to see more and more multiple actors in theaters. And the big question mark, for which I don't have an answer, is whether these multiple actors will be able to work in a coordinated manner. And that will depend much on whether the UN is able to remain the umbrella organization that brings the international community together, or whether we are going to see a much more fragmented strategic scene where various powers watch over their backyard with relations which are more based on balance of power and raw politics than agreed principles, or whether there is a sense that on many issues, and climate is one of them, but there are others, on many issues, the international community is able to go beyond this narrow view and leave the UN to continue to have a central role. And I think the jury is still out on that.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. This brings us to the end of our webinar. As Björn briefly mentioned, we will make the video recording of this webinar available on YouTube in the coming days, and we will be sharing a brief two-pager with all of you. So let me thank you, panelists, for a very interesting, lively discussion, and of course, our audience for your participation. And with that, I would like to ask Björn to make some closing remarks. Björn?
Thank you very much, Benoît. And of course, there's no way on earth I could summarize all these good ideas and visions for the future. But I want to reiterate, Benoît, and congratulate you all of inspiring us with your reflections. And I also want to thank all the participants being out there. And I see you're still hanging around 200 people or locations. We weren't able to feed in all the 27 questions we got. I think we covered 6 or 7 of them, but you should rest assured that we bring them into future webinars, and they will also help enrich our internal discussions. I also want to thank our 2 co-hosts, because Challenges Forum is a network. It is its partners, nothing else. So thanks to Michelle from IPSS and Cedric from NUPI. What we will do with all this then is the question, of course, within the Challenges Forum. I would say that this discussion today will help us in the partnership through the bodies of the advisory committee and the expert group on emerging issues that actually met yesterday with participation from all over the world, to reflect on how we as a partnership best can provide innovative ideas and walk along and support the reform process for effective peace operations, of course, including action for peacekeeping. And there I would like to show to you that on our webpage, you have the consolidated, I think, 3 pages on recommendations on how to implement action for peacekeeping, including with regional partnerships. Our mission is to help shape the debate, and I think you all made substantial contribution to this target today. And as before, you know that we have a lot of information on our website. I also referred to our partners' websites full of information, and of course the US. And as Benoît said, in a couple of days we should have this broadcast on YouTube for you to watch or to spread to your colleagues. I also hope that when you finish participating here, you can respond to the quick survey that comes up with a couple of questions that will help us refine this platform of webinars, which we are deemed to do right now, but we believe it's also part of the future, thinking about the environmental impact and also to bring us all together across borders. I would also like to say that what is coming next from the Challenges Forum, well, it very much depends on our partners, what they propose to us. But what we have upcoming is that we will, in collaboration with the Stockholm Peace and Development Forum, organize a webinar in May focused on sharing experiences from regional organizations on political missions. Because that's part of peace operations, not just peacekeeping, it's also political missions, right? Which I think goes fine with what you mentioned today. In June, we will return with another webinar, and it will be very influenced of all the suggestions and ideas coming up, including the questions from you in the audience. I also want to mention that early fall, we will be finalizing the publication, its 2nd edition, the Considerations for Mission Leadership in UN Peace Operations, which provide guidance for senior mission leadership. And I think that could be a helpful support in the A4P process, but also for regional organizations where we want to strengthen leadership. We hope to arrange, given the state of affairs in the world right now, a virtual annual forum this year in November, December. And we hope that many of you will be able to participate. To start wrapping up, I would really like to thank my team, which you don't see all of them on the screen, but a special thanks to Benoît Pylyser, who's our strategic advisor and who moderated us with such a finesse today. So thanks to you. And behind the scene, which I think the panelists were kindly guided in the beginning, we have Fanny Velian, who's been our producer. So thanks for you too, and the rest of the team for producing this webinar. So finally, we welcome you all back to our dialogue platform, and let us strengthen multilateralism. I think 2 of the polls showed that there is a great interest in multilateral solutions like A4P and others. Because I also believe that in these times we need multilateralism more than ever, including the immediate COVID situation, but also in the medium long term, as I think indicated by Cedric in his vision for the future. So welcome back to our dialogue platform. Thanks to all of you, and especially our panelists, Michelle, Victoria, Cedric, David, and Jean-Marie, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.